those of you between this year and those of you between last year, the interaction between government, business, society, it's a very complex, it's a very dynamic situation. It always keeps changing. As I cite every year the line of the French poet, if the state is strong, it will crush us. If the state is weak, we will perish. So in other words, there is no formula that we are looking at. We are looking at an evolving situation all the time. When I'm on one side as an IAS officer, I see things differently. When I become an entrepreneur, it's a completely different perspective. Is one right? Is the other wrong? No, absolutely not. But it's good to understand the other side much better. Empathy, putting yourself in the other shoes. So the reason we have them here is that you will be able to see how the same problem can be seen differently and how sometimes you condemn people without understanding the real situation. So I'll leave the introductions at that and of course begin with Professor Chandrasekhar with his richness of experience, public figure, academic. I heard you in IIM Ahmedabad when I was there for a training in 1994 of January, possibly. The Gandhi and Hitler was the director of IIM Bangalore those days, if you remember what I mean. So I'll leave it at that. Professor Chandrasekhar, people are always very curious about politicians, always very curious about politicians. Also curious that so much has happened in India, and yet there's so much that has not happened in India. Why is it that we handle partition, which is so difficult? Those who know history were tremendously difficult. The revolution of the states, the Bangladesh crisis, the droughts of the mid-60s, what have you. Amazingly good job we have done. And yet, we have not been able to build on that and make India into a really prosperous economy where people are living a much better quality of life. How would you try to tell it?
I wasn't very sure what I should do, where I should start, whether one speaks from one's own experience in the government, such as it was, and an interaction as a legislator with industry associations and a lot of other people and so on. Wasn't very sure. So I merely looked at very, very briefly what had happened to this equation between business, industry and the government. So it was the need and the justification which was made in this society, in our country, for a certain regulation of the economy and a whole lot of economy implied transactions and so on. So I looked at, very briefly, in that much time, looked at some of the parliamentary debates. And if any of the research students look at them now, it will sound like fiction. The kind of concern they showed to justify why it was necessary, in fact inevitable, for the state to sit in a position which was called commanding heights of the economy and so on, but it's completely foreign now to contemporary situation. But is there a need to regulate at all? Is a question that's being raised since June 1991 and sometimes in very extreme forms. I think there is, clearly. I don't quite belong to the old school of thought which says that you should straitjacket all business activity into some kind of legal regime, etc. That's not it. But what should happen without it? We're still a developing country, although rapidly developing now, despite some hiccups here and there. We're not an underdeveloped country any longer. And given that, the private sector, public sector debate has not been and will never be conclusive anyway, what does one do meanwhile? Well, one simple fact, of the two theories, they elevated themselves to theoretical standing now. The one theory which said that, says even now actually, that a certain regulation is absolutely necessary in order to protect public interest. Maybe the producers, maybe the consumers, certainly maximize public well-being. So some kind of a public interest. Now that's been questioned a great deal by people, and very, very recently, as people here know, a whole lot of economists sitting here. Even now, people like Jagdish Bhagwati and Arvind Panagariya question this very thing, saying, is there a need for any kind of legal regulation at all? I mean, obviously, they have their own logic to that. And their argument essentially is that if you have a legal regulatory system, it's very, very amenable to pressures and influences by resourceful politicians. Obviously, there is some sense in it. We've seen that happening. Resourceful among the investors, they'll begin to control them. That, of course, we have seen in various parts of the country, and certainly I've seen a little bit of that in Karnataka itself. The fact is that corporate wealth in India, and this is what worries it, in one sense, although one should celebrate it, corporate wealth in India has risen quite dramatically in the last 25 years. And a handful of Indians apparently own more than 80% of stock market capitalization. Now, this is not itself a cause for worry, but there is definitely a possibility that at least some in the corporate sector would wield excessive influence over the government. And that would facilitate what the economists call rent-seeking activities, from preferred access to various natural resources, as well as projects in the form of SEZs, oil, coal mining, etc., etc. And we've seen that happen, including, may I say, in Gujarat, quite clearly visible. Some of you might have been there and so on. Now, this kind of relationship, if unchecked, between powerful industrialists and government will give rise to oligarchic capitalism. It may have been used by several people to see that, but I think it's not a cliche. It still works. What they want in terms of their own ideological framework is not oligarchic capitalism, but competitive capitalism. And I think it's very difficult to ensure the latter unless there is some kind of a regulatory regime. That's the point. Now, what kind of regulatory regime? Quite simply put, there should be complete transparency in policy formulation from that stage itself, as well as implementation of regulations. And in the end, that's probably the only answer to the possibility of capture of state organs. It's not a theatrical kind of an expression, capture of state organs. We've seen that happen. We've seen that happen throughout the country, at the center, whatever be the government. And that's not going to end anyway. Now, it's also been suggested by a number of people that business industry organizations would do well to develop and enforce a code of self-discipline, an ethical behavior within the business community. Now, whether this kind of thing is really feasible, whether you see a smile on the faces of people when this kind of thing is said, code of discipline, ethical behavior within the business community, I have no idea. But I think it's being seriously suggested even now by people in the country and elsewhere. And we've been cautioned about the dangers of a weak state. You refer to that, I think, in the couple of paragraphs there, the weak state. What is a weak state anyway? It's been established in different parts of the world. But what is a weak state? How does one understand it? But a combination of weak state and powerful corporate interests can take over virtually by means of political funding, the political need on the part of the political establishment, all these things have happened. There might also be another kind of danger that is beginning to manifest without any sense of apology. The associated question later on, a whole lot of things said about the phenomenon that I referred to, intense pressure that is being brought. You remember, about 3 weeks ago, Prime Minister Narendra Modi had to justify himself in a meeting saying, please trust me, and that was quoted in the newspaper. Please trust, of course, regulation from government at India level, licensing, taxation, incentives, that's the most attractive and the dangerous one. Incentives on new investments in infrastructure, power distribution between the state and business. By which I suppose they mean a structured, continuing dialogue between the state and business associations at every stage. Policy formulation, which of course is the prerogative of the elected government, nevertheless, change in the policy, if any, longevity of policies, assured non-discriminating implementation of regulations, intervention in fixing of prices, etc. Apart from prices, in these other matters, as the senior civil servant who is here, a very highly respected, reputed officer, will probably vouch along with me that any such discrimination given to political and administrative staff is bound to be exercised by them, and that creates problems. So, however, I must mention straight away that I am opposed to what people have demanded, the industries have demanded, even in this country, the complete freedom to hire and fire workers. I think it's not on. It's not on. If a more serious thing, like a land bill, ran into the kind of problems we saw in this country, with a mere 44 members of the Congress party and a handful of other parties in the parliament, and given that it's a federal structure in the parliamentary democracy, you can't really shut them out of people, demonstrations and so on, that a very powerful government with a huge, unprecedented majority had to back out on the land bill. So I think, given that we are signatories to ILO Convention on labour standards, signatory to United Nations, conventions on human rights, I really don't think any government can support labour reforms. This component of labour reform, certainly it needs to be reformed, but this component, that you should have absolute freedom to hire and fire, I think that's not possible. But on the other hand, the concern of industries, and I have seen, with streamlining various obstructionist laws, protection of IPRs, provision of, it hasn't materialized until now. Global democracies haven't done very much better. I'm particularly interested in climate change and its impact.
Thanks, big sentence. What we discussed, of course, regulation is required, but to regulate, not do. Difference between government as a doer and government facilitating. And a weak state is one where the rule of law is not enforced. Weak state is not when a dictator is required, absolutely not. Mr. Patnaik, as a former civil servant, I have a natural sympathy for the civil services. And between the two of us, I calculate we have 67 years of the civil service behind us. That's a lot between two of us. No? Why is it that despite the fact, and not because you and I got to the civil service, we get such good talent into the civil service, absolutely good talent coming into the civil service? Why is it that the public image has taken such a beating? Yes, politicians are there, there are all kinds of politicians, the systems are sometimes not good, but what is it everywhere? Have you introspected enough to realize why this is happening and what should we be going ahead?
Go there.
And Professor Sinha for inviting me to this panel discussion. In fact, it has been very nice on my part to hear Professor Chandrasekhar. He has stated something which many of us may not be in agreement, coming as it is You are business school students, and the discussion is on business, government and society relationship. But at the same time, I will come to the particular question which Professor Sinha asked me, but before that I would like to just go through our back. What is India? As Professor Chandrasekhar said, India is not US, India is not also China. India is not one of the developed countries of the world. India is a developing country. Recently the World Bank was generous enough to classify us as a middle income country. The definitions of World Bank keeps on changing depending on to whom they want to give loan and whom they don't want. That's how it is. Whatever said, India has 200 million people who do not have food to eat. The maximum number of malnutrited children are in India. At the same time, we have industrialists where their wealth has grown exponentially, which Professor Chandrasekhar just now said. And there is a yawning gap between the rich and the poor. In this type of scenario, and considering the constraints of a parliamentary democracy, we must evaluate ourselves that in these 60 years, have we done justice to our economy? You all know, you would have studied, that we are not a laissez-faire economy. When Adam Smith propagated his free economic theory, we are not that. We are not also a socialist economy, because primarily we are now a mixed economy, where both private sector and public sector coexist. Private sector today addresses itself to the units of production mostly, of course leaving apart certain infrastructural projects, and the social and economic development is concentrated or is the work of the government. So government has a very difficult thing to balance. It has to take care of the interest of business or industries, which provides the growth. In modern terms, when you say that our economy is growing 6% or 7%, actually it is investment which flows, it generates jobs, and in a way it also fuels the entire process of development. At the same time, there are issues like this which government has to address. And how do you balance? If you take the history of any country in the world, the European economy which you see today was not this, not the Americans were like that. They were a small, Britishers ruled United States of America, Britishers also ruled us. But of course, due to the American Revolution, it took a different tangent altogether, and today US is #1 country. China took a different dimension altogether. There is no democracy whatsoever, and yet they have reached the same sense of economic development which today United States, and today it's, maybe in the future it is likely to beat United States. We are nowhere, we are neither in these two extremes, so therefore the challenges are many. If you take the history of colonial India, the civil service came into existence by the Britishers. The ICS, the Indian Civil Service, mainly played to the gallery in terms of protected the economic interest of the British Empire. From that, we came over to a free India where the Indian Administrative Service was born. The civil servants of yesterday, I would say much to what Professor just now said, that the common perception is that they are not performing enough or they have not performed enough. I would like to dispel that doubt. If India is today what it is, to a great extent, we must acknowledge the contribution of the civil servants of this country. And whatever may be the challenges today, when he mentions about short successes, that is conduct of election, or let us say rising to the crisis of earthquake in Nepal, or due to cyclones, we have performed extremely well. But when it comes to doing sustainable development, we are not doing well. This perception is where you go to rural India today. I do not think if you knock the door of a poor man today in any part of the country, he has any grouse about the so-called bureaucracy which is in lethargy. It is in the modern urban world that we find articles been written that the bureaucrats are not good. I visited certain embassies outside my own country. And I also visited some embassies in Delhi. Some of you might also knock the doors of embassies of United States of America in Chennai or any country. I don't find anyone standing there to receive you. You are standing on the road in Chennai, with the open hot sun. From morning, nobody is there to ask. They are civilized countries of the world. They treat human beings as human resources. Yet they don't think a person who is entering the country needs a place to sit. He needs some water to drink. He may attend to nature's call. No, it is not there. When we do that, we say, you see, government is totally, they are not bothered about our people. It's the same everywhere. Bureaucracy is same everywhere. When the American police handcuffs you, not in the front, behind your back, throws you out. A diplomat was body searched, the Indian diplomat. I'm not saying she did all the things right, but we don't treat those criminals. But has anyone said the Indian prison system or the Indian police is better? Nobody says that. Now that's what I want to dispel that doubt. It's a popular perception. It's a perception which comes through the television sets, through the newspaper. But that's not the reality. The same industrialists I met privately have admitted, oh, it is because of you things are moving. The other day I met a IT giant. I complimented his campus, not here in Bangalore or Mysore, but somewhere else. I said, maybe we didn't do anything for you, for the IT sector, because you did things on your own and the internet did the rest of the job. And today you are big people and you are really contributing to the economy. He said, no, it's not so. Government had a very big role to play. Why do you say that? He said that to me. I wanted to be the devil's advocate. But he said, no, it's not so. Government did many things incrementally which cannot be assembled in one capsule form and sort of disseminated to the general public. Government is there everywhere, even in the American economy. I can say, which speaks about minimum governance, the ideal of a limited government has been swept aside, and positive government engulfs us despite voices to cut back some areas of government authority. The government now affects every facet of corporate operations. The way firms assemble capital are defined by statute. It is also in our country. Production decisions are made with regard to public, environmental and energy policies. Marketing practices, accounting rules, employees' relations, policies, occupational health and safety standards are within the ambit of the government policy. It is also in America also. It is not only in India. India may have a little more restrictive policy. Time has come for amending some of the laws. But as Professor B.K. Chandrasekhar said, we cannot dismantle it altogether. Because we are a developing nation, there are sections of the population which needs the government, which needs to tie itself to the apron strings of the government for it to survive. And we can't let the free flow of the market economy, because will be swept aside. And therefore, this balance will continue, and I am certain the civil servants of today, why they are seen not to be that dedicated, it's a general, I would say it's a value system in general has dipped low in this country. It's not that, why so, let me give you a simple example. Why so many cases of atrocities on women and children? Is it that, what has happened now? Was it that it existed and it was never reported, now only it is coming? I don't think you agree to this. I am certain that perceptively things have gone. Why it has happened? Is government responsible for this? There is a general degradation in the value system, and part of it is also due to the unnecessary influence of becoming rich at any cost, whatever may be the thing. So much of cheating, so much of this thing is only coming. You see, the biggest industrialists are always involving in quarrels over properties of their father. Are they poor people? Why they are quarreling? I don't see the reason. I can imagine a poor man quarreling because he needs to educate his son or have survival problems. But they are quarreling, engaging the best of advocates to settle their disputes. And then they quarrel, they separate, their bank balance reduces, suddenly that also becomes equal or bigger than that. I do not know. I leave it as a question in your minds. Now coming to the other question which Professor Chandrasekhar said, should the civil service be reformed? Yes, it needs to be reformed. We are going through a process of reformation. Post 91, everything is in a process of reformation. The civil servants of today cannot ignore the changes that is taking place around them, the changes that is being fueled by the revolutions in the field of IT and IT related services just cannot be ignored. We have to find new ways of doing things. We need to have more efficient way of doing things. Yet at the same time, the civil servants need stability and there is a need for stable tenures. And parliamentary democracy is definitely important. But of late I may say, much to the chagrin of our Professor Chandrasekhar, that the interference, or that's a very negative word, the influence from political leadership also has grown proportionately. Everyone today, you can say it's not the civil servant, it's the politicians, it is the industrialists, we have come to a remote control culture. We cannot wait for the TV to open. We want it instant. Why it's not open? Internet, why it's not? My speed is low. I just cannot wait. We want instant result. And this is where instant noodle, instant result, that is what the entire thing is going. Nobody is prepared. Yesterday a rape takes place, the people demand, why have you not cracked it today? Is it physically possible? You tell me. This is what people don't understand. And people blame. And they want, no, you must. Everyone pounces on us. You produce some result. This producing some result is the bane of this country. Professor Sinha has worked in Afghanistan, I just heard. There is a UN system. It is notoriously slow. But there are due diligence before they pump in money to any place. The World Bank does that exactly. When Professor Chandrasekhar said that there should be transparency in procurement, see the transparency laws of the World Bank. They are totally different from the Karnataka Transparency Act. They are not the same. There is a hell and heaven difference between the two. And that's why it's not producing the desired result. Because if I spend 100 rupees, I must set apart 20 rupees to see that the remaining 80 rupees is spent properly. This is the system of the United Nations. This is the system of many of the advanced produce results sincerely and diligently, which is not so. Government is very complex and complicated. Last but not the least, I must underline the importance of legal reforms in this country. Day before yesterday I read, if all the cases which are pending in different courts in this country are to be disposed of, it will take the next 30 years. Now, 30 years or something like that. It didn't really. I think it calls for some serious thinking on whosoever is in charge of that. Beyond that, I don't want to say anything. Thank you, Professor, for giving me the floor.
In fact, one of the reasons why we score very low on the ease of doing business and global competence report is the fact that in India cases take a long time. So contracts cannot be enforced, as we all know. But after those things, the global picture, to come down, to drill down to active interaction, lobbying is not considered a good word in our country. Somehow we feel that lobbying is a dirty word. At the same time, we have to recognize that industry associations, consumer associations, trade bodies, trade unions, etc. are very important stakeholders in the country, not only economic growth in the country. As the Chamber of Commerce, and with a rich background in Greenlays, BPO, NASCOM, etc. Two things. One, how does the Chamber of Commerce represent its interest, who may have diverse? So where to draw? And I remember the controversy of CII's Committee on Defense, FDI and Defense, that the chairman wanted one thing, the member wanted something else. So how to reconcile the differences, one, and two, how to engage with the government in a good, transparent, proactive manner to bring about change?
I would seek indulgence for a bit. I just wanted to add to what Mr. Patnaik had said about bureaucracy.
I hope you'll contradict. The idea is to generate some excitement.
No, I'd like to share some personal experience about my own journey about what I thought of bureaucrats and what I think of bureaucrats now. So, before I joined NASSCOM, my view of bureaucrats was that they were a bunch of babus who were paid to sit on their backside. Please, if I use words which are partially unparliamentary, please bear with me. Who were paid to sit on the backside, not push anything, try and avoid taking decisions, etc., etc., etc. That was my view before I joined NASSCOM. And before I joined NASSCOM, I'd spent a long time in the private sector, in banking, in the BPO industry. When I joined NASSCOM, one of the roles that I had, one of the tasks that was given to me was to handle government relations. And one of the first things that I had to do was to interact with bureaucrats in the central government. With the mindset that I had, and the private sector arrogance that I had, I was dead sure that I could walk in, have a discussion without any preparation, I could win the discussion. I went in for the first discussion and got creamed. I didn't know what hit me. I walked out saying that this is the exception that proves the rule. This is the one bureaucrat who's intelligent, the rest are all klutzies. Went for the second meeting, went for the third, fourth. Every single time, I was really taken to the cleaners. I didn't know what hit me. And slowly the realization started dawning that maybe my going in assumption was wrong. That they are not a bunch of clerks, they have something between the ears upstairs. And then I actually started spending a lot of time preparing for a meeting. And to my surprise, on not one but on several occasions where a view was taken which was diametrically opposite to what the bureaucrat was taking, the view was respected, provided there was a logic in it. You couldn't just stand up and say, I disagree with you. And over the years, I spent about four odd years in NASSCOM, my respect for bureaucracy, for the competence, increased many fold. In fact, I would say the pendulum swung from one end to the other end. There was also a very deep realization of the constraints within which the bureaucrats operate. You've seen that recently, a couple of months ago, when there was this issue about Kejriwal taking a bureaucrat, mentioning a bureaucrat by name, and a lot of bureaucrats came up to her support saying that you're being very unfair because they cannot respond in public. Because those are service rules. Now, if you can't expect somebody to defend himself when their hands are tied behind the back, as when they were arrested in the US system. So, one needs to appreciate the fact that there is a huge amount of information, there is a huge amount of data, there is a wealth of intelligence and intention that is there. There are constraints which prevent bureaucracy from moving. So, all of us who are urban elites need to seriously introspect and check whether we are actually being fair in castigating bureaucrats. And I would agree with him entirely that if you go into non-urban India, chances are they'll be fairly, it may not be a completely rosy picture, but it will be fairly supportive. The progress that is there is there for all to see. It's not all roses, there are still miles to go. But the progress that has been achieved is phenomenal. And I think that's something which I just felt I needed to share because my own experience has been where the pendulum in my case has swung from one extreme to the other extreme. As of today, I have enormous amount of respect for bureaucrats. So I just thought I'd share that. The question that you asked, how do lobbying is a bad word, and I think one of the reasons why lobbying is a bad word that is in India it is done in a very clandestine manner. There is no legislation. If I, as a Chamber of Commerce, want to reach out to a bureaucrat under the guise of presenting the views of industry, the government does not know whether I represent the industry or I represent a segment of it. When I say it is industry, it is one company or a set of companies. Now, in a lot of countries where lobbying is recognized, there is legislation. And there are certain norms that have to be followed. Because in India it is that regulation or the legislation is not there, and there is in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, there was an issue relating. We lived under what is euphemistically called the license Raj, where it didn't matter what you did; it mattered whom you knew, and therefore the opaqueness that was there allowed this kind of lobbying, and that's why lobbying as such has got a bad name. But I think, to be fair to chambers of commerce, we've come a long way, and it's still a journey to be completed. But I think in many respects we have addressed things and try and be as open as possible. For example, you will see chambers like CII, FICCI, ASSOCHAM, ourselves, NASSCOM, a lot of representations when they are made to the government, they are posted on the website. So there isn't a secret agenda. So it is being submitted to the government and it's out there in the open for everyone to see. There are occasional representations which are made, which for various reasons cannot be put up publicly. Illustratively, when I was with NASSCOM, there was a very deep engagement that happened with the Ministry of Home Affairs and electronic device service provider relating to privacy, secrecy, infringement, and allowing the government to access the messages which were suspected of being used by terrorists. Now, those representations, those discussions obviously will not be out in the open. But most of the things are out in the open. So to some extent, I think we are in the process of trying to clean up our act on whether, on how the dirt from the word lobbying can be scraped off.
And a more structured form of...
Absolutely. The other piece that you asked, what do you do when there are contradicting views? More often than not, most chambers, please keep in mind that chambers are funded by members. A lot of chambers have graded memberships. So the larger the organization, the larger the membership fee that is paid. Quite often it happens that when there is a very large member who's demanding something and a smaller member who's opposing that, the smaller member is ignored. You push the larger agendas, larger members' agenda. Having said that, more often than not, most chambers make an effort that if there is an issue that is raised by a member, try and reach out to industries in the similar sector to see if there is a similar problem, and then represent it as a broader agenda. I've not come across instances where, in my personal experience, where there are issues which are diametrically opposite, where two members, one is opposing and one is favoring it. I have come across instances where a representation is made or a request is made for making a representation which is not in the larger public interest, which chambers have refused to take up. For example, most recently there was this issue relating to the size of pictorial warnings on cigarettes. And except one chamber, everyone, none of the other chambers across states, across the country, picked it up. There was only one chamber that said that you should restrict it to 40% and not take it to 80%. Apart from that, none of the other chambers. So you sometimes use the filter of public interest before taking up an issue. So
I think that
does that answer the...
It does answer a lot of it, absolutely. But quickly that I've been saying good things about bureaucracy, and more people say good things. So I hope Mr. Sudhanva will not disappoint me and tell us the other side of the picture, especially because being an entrepreneur, being a local boy who studied in school in Mysore, demonstration school and then KRS, which is the other school, college here, we went to Worcester there, right, to do our studies, worked elsewhere, now developed Saras. You tell us a couple of things because a lot of the people out here want to be entrepreneurs on their own. Startups is the word that is quite popular. Thank God for that. At the same time, we hear people telling us horror stories of how you try to set up a factory or a unit and how petty, I use the word, petty procedures bog you down. I'm not being an individual part of the system, right? So how do you manage to think like an entrepreneur, gather your finances, gather your people, take out the people that you don't like, the professors you don't like it, take out the people you don't like, and yet handle the petty bureaucracies of across offer it cross purpose? How do you manage it?
Well, I should say that firstly, we did speak about ease of doing business, and my general feeling, I've been an entrepreneur building a business for 15 years now. Ease of doing business, honestly, has eased up a little. There's quite a lot of things. Why do I, as an entrepreneur, CEO, a founder of a business, think it's eased up a little bit? Not eased up a whole lot. Is because a lot of it is electronic. We file our VAT returns electronically, we file our TDS returns electronically, we file our service tax returns electronically, we pay it electronically. So we don't have to actually sit down, have a large team which is at the end of the month doing lots of reconciling, paperwork, etc. What we're doing electronically can ease up a little bit more. It can be better. The user experience can be better. But it does take away a few things. One, it brings in a little bit of a system where you don't get unnecessarily harassed by local bureaucracy because it's all online. It's reasonably transparent. I personally feel, Professor Chandrasekhar would remember this. As a startup in Mysore, and as somebody who has been part of the information technology industry in Mysore, Mysore has, for the last 15-20 years, has always been the next big thing to happen, waiting to happen after Bangalore, from a technology industry and a technology ecosystem
And you're still
perspective.
waiting.
And we're still waiting for 15-20 years. So that's a bit of a mystery. I sometimes wonder, we have all the ingredients. We've had, in fact, great governmental support. Professor Chandrasekhar created a task force. NASSCOM did quite a lot to try and bring a spark into the technology industry in Mysore. Successive governments have done quite a lot. The secretaries and the Department of IT has done quite a bit. I, in fact, would think the onus is on the local stakeholders. It's on the entrepreneurs, the working professionals, the other key stakeholders in Mysore to actually pick it up and build momentum to create that kind of a ecosystem. It's always a catch-22 kind of a situation. What comes first? We many times feel that you first want big brands and large businesses to come into Mysore so that brand Mysore can surface, and then you can attract more businesses to come in, a good startup ecosystem to come in, get visibility amongst the venture funding companies, private equity players, etc. We've seen Infosys happening in Mysore, big brand, a large campus, a benchmark, world class. We thought that would be a catalyst where around that a large ecosystem will happen. And it's been quite a few years. We are seeing some momentum, but not a whole deal has happened. So I think the onus is really on local stakeholders, business schools, engineering colleges, the education system, the entrepreneurs to make this happen. There is a startup ecosystem. It's not that it is completely absent. There are innovative people, there are some innovative companies, but I think overall we need the critical mass to take Mysore to the next level.
Following it up, and I'll go around this way, you mentioned Infosys, this massive neo-Palladian fog working structure that we see, where you train 30,000-40,000 people a year. Why then do we need colleges at all? If every company has to set up massive training center to bring people up to here to work for the company, why have higher education in India at all?
Well, I'm sure they had their own reasons to build their global education center, and probably their own kind of format and pedagogical approach to wanting to train new recruits and working professional in Infosys. My personal belief is that it can be done equally effectively if the industry and the academia can work closely with each other. There is so much we can share. There's so much value that we can bring to each other. So what the industry and the business requires can actually be met by the academia, by business schools like Myra, by engineering colleges. It's just that there have been forums, CII and Chambers of Commerce and others, NASCOM, have tried to bring them together quite often. And it's happened in Mysore as well. But it's not just the start. I think we need a sustainable model where this engagement can be intense and can actually produce employable graduates, which many people complain or easily missing.
Absolutely. It's so difficult to find. Yeah, please. There's a mic right there. Please jump.
And from what Professor Sukhan Dhananjay said, you have an opportunity to develop a non-polluting activity here. The ambition was about 15 years old now. What do you think will be the precise triggers which would make it happen? All these things about business schools and other kinds of pressure, I really don't think is going to work on that much. Some inside stories, probably we know why they don't work. It should continue. We should embarrass the politicians. But when politicians come to your meetings, for instance, I've been to also chairman forum. You come with good officers like our friend here. But what do I do as a minister there? What do I do when I go back to the cabinet or to the legislature? It entirely depends on him. And I still believe very strongly that the top level officers are really excellent in command. I'm not saying it.
Long 40 kilometers. It's always beaten us.
But something is happening. What is it? Even Infosys has given up. I mean, they really said you raised a very, very pertinent question on this training thing as well. So what after that? What has failed here?
Well, I think the first wave of success we've seen in the technology industry, and particularly IT, you would agree, was pretty much a pure services play. And a lot of what happened initially depended on the cost arbitrage. So it was cheaper to get talent in India, cheaper to do a certain kind of development in India when compared to doing it in the US, where the opportunity here was big and the customers existed in North America, Europe, whatever else. I think that's changed significantly now. I think that the typical templatized kind of a services model is not going to work anymore. If businesses, company and this industry will have to see another inflection point and seriously grow and make a big mark on the world stage. There was a school for data analytics, and Mysore was known for excellence in data analytics or an excellence in cloud computing. You can't be everything to everybody all the time. If you spend 20 years.
You want something like a research triangle of Chapel Hill to be.
Yes, I guess Silicon Valley happened that.
Right.
There has to be that intent.
But on a more mundane level, as an outsider who comes to Mysore, Mysore will never be an air destination. Airlines may run any flight at 7 o'clock or 4:45. And time, they change the time at 1 day's notice. We talked about, but Randy talked about that. If, supposing, rail makes a lot of sense, you run 6 trains a day between Bangalore and Mysore, 90 minutes time travel. Just see the difference in number of people able to access Mysore. So if I have to come to Mysore from Delhi, I'll think twice. Just Delhi utrenge, I have to hire a cab, then drive through Bangalore town, which, despite the dialogue, takes an hour and a half. It puts you off. It really becomes off-putting.
Yeah.
So I guess something like that. And moving on, Mr. Bhatnagar, we are discussing this kind of thing. I think this is where don't you think that industry associations and CIA has done some work, but an industry association also has limitations in the sense that they have to be good to politicians. They have to be good when they meet government, leaders, bureaucrats. We have to upload work with them. We can't start abusing them. Deepak Parekh is something else, I would think. We're not going to that. Deepak Parekh traditionally has never criticized the government. In the late 90s, it was said, if Sharad Pawar wants economic advice, he goes to Deepak Parekh. If Bal Thackeray wants economic advice, he goes to Deepak Parekh. If Pramod Mahajan wants economic advice, he goes to Deepak Parekh. Right? So you normally don't upset people you are working with them. So I understand industrial has the limitations, but in terms of actually pushing towards based on solid research, not original research but outsourced research, how, when do we reach a stage where the Chamber of Commerce here would be a knowledge partner of the government in developing new policies and not individual and not problems? One is problems, reactive, but in terms of proactively developing, pushing policies.
So, before I answer that, let me answer the first piece, that one necessarily has to be nice to the bureaucrats and politicians. I think over the last decade or decade and a half, there is a greater degree of openness.
Right.
And you have, so as a chamber of commerce or industry, one identifies a set of politicians and bureaucrats
Right.
with whom you necessarily have to be nice. So you make the necessary noise.
Right.
I would say that's in a minority of about 20, maybe 25%.
Right.
75% of politicians and bureaucrats are open to listening. Are
Open to
open to
listening.
listening. So they will not reject you out of hand. Whether their listening translates into action is a different story. But you don't necessarily have to be nice. So I think that is a journey that is
Polite. Okay.
no, you're free to tell them, I don't think this is working. I mean, for example, we've had discussions with the government
Right.
in Bangalore, saying that the infrastructure in Bangalore is pathetic. There is something, and initially it was a little one had to wordsmith it a bit,
But then now
but
you
you can talk
can
about
honest
it.
and frank.
And and similarly talk about different issues within the state that need to be addressed. There are things which are, say for example, the APMC, which is the Agriculture,
Use market committees.
the APMC Act, which in many ways seems to have outlived its utility. To turn around and tell the government that there are other states who do it, it's not that it's not more, it's not. But why can't we do something like that? And those are things that are heard. Answering your question, when does one and how does one get a point across through outsourced research or that's something that continues to be done. It's not something that is not being done. The information that is sent, if I just take the issue relating to APMC, I think the representations go back at least 7 to 8 years. Pretty much the representations are regurgitated year after year or every second year and submitted. There is some amount of tweaking that is done, bringing it up to date. One also has to realize and recognize that there are some imperatives which prevent changing of that legislation as it exists. And unless the ground changes or the ground reality changes, it's going to be very difficult to change that. So, is there a way that one can start partnering with the government or saying, okay, take one commodity out and let's expand it?
Right.
Those are things which one tries to push through. And what we're also seeing of late is that on issues that really hurt, multiple chambers of commerce come together and make a common representation of the government.
That makes a lot of sense.
As a result, the weight that is there gets added. Instead of each one going and saying the same thing individually 10 times, if 10 of us go together and make exactly the same presentation, we all have our logos on the top, so there are 10 logos on the top, 5 at the bottom, and all of that kind of thing. But that carries that much more weight. So those kind of things have also started.
Ultimately, you think that incremental change is the way forward. As Swaminathan Iyer used to say, India, we have a strong commitment to make reforms.
Hope lives eternal.
Absolutely.
So one is hopeful that the incremental changes will slowly become, the increment stages will become larger.
Mr. Patnaik, you said everything I wanted to ask you already, but I can't get you up so easily. Right? Why is it that we in the government, and I'm still thinking of myself so long in the government, as being in the government, I'm not in the government, but people in the government, even today when we look at the private sector, as we're not prepared to concede space as a partner, because in our minds it has been drilled, right, wrong is not the point, it's been drilled, profit is bad. Private sector is here for profit. And I have to tell people, no, income, like my salary. Is my salary bad? No. So how do we make this change in government that rent seeking is bad, but Kanchika is absolutely right. Crony capitalism is bad, absolutely. Competition is good. So how do we create an ecosystem that encourages competition and allows private sector greater space?
Before I answer this particular, I would like to take a leaf out from what Mr. Bhatnagar said, that you take the recent reforms of the unified market, agricultural market in Karnataka. Sectors, many studies have been conducted, and most of these studies are done by the Chamber of Commerce. The Chamber of Commerce uses this blueprint to influence the government to change its policies. Earlier, these documents were not really looked at with suspicion, but not anymore. As and when time passed, government has made liberal use of some of these studies, and incrementally as policies have changed. Bureaucrats are not the policy makers of this country, let me clarify it. If there is an elected leadership which says, no, I want it this way, the next day the bureaucrat finds a way how to make it happen. So therefore, to blame it on the bureaucrat that I am not looking at it in a particular way because the Chamber of Commerce has said so would be absolutely wrong. The question is, whosoever is trying to give their inputs to the policy makers, they must convince all the stakeholders of the policy makers that this is good for the country, this is how public good will take place, then I am certain it's going to happen. You take, I can give a plethora of examples, but I just restricted myself to the agricultural marketing example just now. So I would stop here.
Before I come from that chicken to wrap up, I think Mr. Sudhana wants to say something. No?
Yeah, I missed answering one of your questions.
Oh, most sure. So good. So now you remember.
So I think one of the questions you asked was
for them,
addressed to them. You know, it was about is it good to aspire to be entrepreneurs or good to go build careers, getting employed, and should there be a gap? And that's kind of a mixed question. I think time and again there are lots of startups who have proved successful, grown into large businesses, and have been profit making, have delivered return on investment to their shareholders and to employees. So becoming an entrepreneur, creating an organization for profit and wanting to make significant profits and deliver return on investments, there's nothing wrong about it. I think in this country, we are talking about economic development, we're talking about wanting to be an economic superpower, we want to compete in the global marketplace, we want to create an identity for our country. It's not going to happen just by large corporates, government and bureaucracy. It has to also happen quite a lot by the entrepreneurship movement, the startups and the businesses that grow eventually. So I would really encourage all of you to think about ideas. It could be you go out and get some exposure in a workplace, spend a couple of years, etc. But if you want to find good ideas and you want to turn them into successful businesses, I think there are enough enablers. There is policy support. There is you may have to, you will have to fight the system sometimes. Nothing comes easily. That's true anywhere in the world. I think nothing comes to you on a platter. You will have to work hard, persevere. But if you do that, I think we have enough examples, and I think there's a great environment where all the enablers are in place, including funding. I mean, there's so much interest in startups today. There's so many funds who are interested in coming and funding great ideas and new businesses, high growth ideas. So what I would really do is to try and encourage you to get into a mindset of wanting to be entrepreneurs, wanting to be part of the growth story of the Indian business.
Absolutely. And as those of you who remember the class, 98% of all companies in France and UK are small companies, employing 46 and 42% of the labor force. In India, there are only 76%, which is good enough, but employing only 17%. So I think there is a huge world out there for small companies. Huge world out there. Don't look to become infosys. One day you will, I'm very happy. Don't wait. Start. Absolutely.
I just want to add one thing.
Before I ask.
Between entrepreneurs and becoming employees of some corporation, someone told the joke, maybe it's reality. All IITians, they don't want to take risks, they want to become employees of big corporates. But Steve Jobs and Bill Gates never went to MIT, but they themselves become entrepreneurs. Choice is yours. I think if you have entrepreneurship in your blood, you must take the plunge. Secondly, I want to say, if India has to really make progress, forget this democracy debate and otherwise ease of doing business, we should be concentrating on cutting edge technology. Today, the cutting edge technology is with the United States, and the next country which is closely following it is China. You take nanotechnology, biotechnology, and all the advances of technology today, it's with this particular select group. And India should really focus attention on this. If Mysore wants to be an epicenter of that, let it be, but the thinking process should begin. We have the skills, we have the human resources, we must target it right now. Because otherwise, we'll miss, just like we missed the industrial revolution of the past era, we'll also miss this particular.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Professor Chandrasekhar, I must ask you, Raghuram Rajan is an academic with his colleague Zingaris wrote this lovely book called Saving Capitalism from Capitalists.
Sorry?
Saving Capitalism from Capitalists. In other words, those who are in the room do not want those outside to enter the room. Why is it, it's a perception, maybe wrong, that all these barriers that we create in setting up new firms is basically done, the guys inside the room don't want competition, and we in the system, the politician, the bureaucrat, we go along with the industrialist to keep new entrepreneurs out. How do you react to something like that?
Well, I think, at a very serious, simple things like hospital administration, okay? There's a huge void of information on the part of politicians. I'll give you an example. Industry is more complex. There has been an outbreak over the last 6 months of dengue fever, malaria, and another new strain of whatever it is. They call it infectious arthritis and so on. All the nursing homes and hospitals in Bangalore are full up. It's been happening for 4 or 5 months. So some people went to one of the ministers, okay, here in Karnataka, and said, look, this is happening. There are too many, nothing has been done about mosquitoes. Everybody knew that basically this also mosquito. And the man asked them, Ashtu solla idya Bangalore? Ashtu solla idya. So many mosquitoes, so much of mosquitoes. Secondly, an officer of the same department says, at the end of the discussion, that, sir, fogging, spraying things, clearing stagnant water, stormwater drains, all these things, which gives rise to mosquito. Madla Kannadadalli ಹೇಳ್ಬಿಡ್ತೀನಿ, and then I translate. He said, Nodi sir, hinge ಹೇಳೋದು. By the way, that man Sitaram himself was in hospital for 10 days. Okay? But he was lucky, he got admission because everybody knew him. Then he told, they said it's BBM, it's corporation's responsibility. So Sitaram told me, yeah, these mosquitoes are pretty dumb and stupid. They don't know whom to bite in which jurisdiction. Yeah.
You must educate them.
I mean, you get furious about such things. I mean, something doable. What is so difficult about it? Okay, just one or two other things to say. I want to ask you, you know, the BJP said in it,
Can you run a absolutely ethical, compliant business and still be profitable? I think the answer is yes. And you've seen several, you can see several instances of that happening. So it's just a question of, you know, you want to preserve integrity and be ethical, be fully compliant, and still be profitable. Possible.
You're right, absolutely right. I mean, that's the whole idea. But I think our incentive structures also. And I think competition is the greatest element of incentive. And second, recognizing if there is a demand supply mismatch, say in certain sectors of education, and you put caps on fees, you will generate that money. That's all you will do. Because the real cost of money will show up somewhere. You can hide it, but it will show up. So in that sense.
Can I ask you a student something?
They've had a long exam, that's all.
government business equations or relations or whatever. Is it feasible? It should be actually, but can you afford the time, if you haven't already done so, to take up specific sectors and see what's happened? There aren't enough studies so far as I could see, you know. Specific sectors on this relationship between government and business and see what's happened. Very specific one. Secondly, what's happened to local case studies? This is a very general question, nothing to do with today's thing. I don't know if the school here encourages case studies of what happens in Mysore, around Mysore, in Karnataka, etc. They do. Well, you remember that famous case of the Mumbai Dabawalas? Not a single Indian Institute of Management in this country took up a case study. You know how it came about? When Prince Charles visited here, came here. Was it Prince Charles or Duke of Edinburgh? Prince Charles. Prince Charles. He came about 10 years ago and they had briefed him very well. The British Deputy High Commissioner in Bangalore told me they had briefed him very well. They had done some research. He spent an hour with them, the Dabawalas in Mumbai. Then he invited 7 people to go to Buckingham Palace in London. The Dabawalas. When they came back, suddenly the IIMs were activated.
In fact, even recently on the Kumbh Mela, an excellent book has come out by Harvard or MIT. Excellent detail. They sent 50 people. 50 people came from the US to study Kumbh Mela. None of us think of Kumbh Mela as a big deal. It is such a big deal to set up that township for a short period. Millions of people, nothing goes wrong except for one stampede, I think, in the early 80s in Haridwar. You know, so I think he's got a point. We ignore our society around
You
us.
come from Delhi.
I'm Delhi wala.
I've enjoyed
Darshini coffee here. Okay. One of the people who developed the Darshini type of cafe, steam cooking,
Right.
excellent coffee and so on, is a man called Vasudeva Adiga. The Adiga's restaurant,
Adiga.
chain of restaurant. Now this chap was an engineering graduate, you know. I've spoken to him, discussed with him a lot. He was a BE from Mangalore, from a respectable college. He didn't get a job at that stage for about 5-6 months or so. Then he started this. A whole chain of hotels everywhere, not a single case study on Vasudeva Adiga by any business. You know, this whole entrepreneurship, how it came about, etc.
I think the examples of entrepreneurship are so clear.
Can
There
I-
is scope everywhere.
Can I add a trivia to what Professor Chand? I just wanted to add a trivia. You mentioned about Prince Charles. About 4 or 5 years before Prince Charles came, the British Standards Institute, which is like our not the ISI. It's like our Bureau of Indian Standards. It's the equivalent. BIA. Interpretations reduces. Second, there should be continuity. Continuity. So it shouldn't happen that the law keeps changing every once and so often, or gets retrospective amendments made. Those kind of things are avoided. That's second. Third, as far as functioning is concerned, there should be transparency. Fourth, reduce the amount of discretion, if possible, eliminate it. Because wherever there is discretion, there is corruption. And in an ideal scenario, if there is scope, one should continually revisit perspective We are happy to collaborate with a foreign company but not trust our own Indian company. I found it completely bizarre.
Absolutely.
So at some point in time, that maybe that law, that rule, that legislation had merit. But it's one more example where one needs to revisit those
Again.
laws again and again. And just see it as
Talk
well.
about a big thing. Delhi, we have an act of the Delhi Sarai Act. Sarai are those traditional places where visitors stay. It's a law of 1860s which says every evening the Sarai owner must inform the local police station who is staying in the Sarai. Well, guess which are the Sarais of today? The Hiltons, the Oberois, and the Taj. So every evening they have to give a manual report till last year. Now it's electronic. They can file it electronically. They have to give a manual report to the local SHO. These are our hotel guests tonight. Can you imagine? So you're right, absolutely right. We need to revisit them again and again and again. Quick question from anybody? Anybody wants a quick question?
Professor Chandrasekhar.
Use the mic.
Thank you, professors and distinguished guests, for your invigorating talk and all the insights which you have shared across. And I have this particular question to Dr. Chandrasekhar sir, who was part of the Karnataka government during 2003 and 2004. It's regarding the outer ring road of Bangalore. Though it has come up during 2003 or 2004, which was came into action, but immediately within couple of years you started, especially Bangalore BDA or BBMP started constructing flyovers or underpasses or trying to eliminate the signals. Within 2 years, how could this be possible? Because if that has been taken care in the first place, most of the people's lives, like me and many of the people who has worked in Bangalore or studied in Bangalore, we would have ended up spending more time in college or in a house rather than in traffic jams. Could you please help me in this, answering this?
Can you repeat, because Professor
Yeah.
have some.
So basically it's
I mean, you made the road first, then you started doing the elimination of traffic lights and flyovers. Had you done it from the beginning, this thing would have. Lack of coordinates. Execution first, planning later.
Well, actually, you don't need flyovers all over the place. There are dozens of other models.
Is rail. And it should be a continuing kind of thing. I just mentioned 3 or 4 places in Bangalore. I've never understood why we didn't get onto that kind of thing. You need what you call jump overs in some places. You don't need those huge big flyovers. And then another great idea that's come up now is they want to do the steel flyover, steel elevated road rather, steel made elevated road from Minerva Circle up to I wouldn't say it, a road above an existing road, an elevated road like to the electronic city. There's no great engineering there. We can do that. And the road to the airport, for instance, you take an hour to reach the Hebbal flyover, and then you take 20 minutes. So I kept arguing at the time. There was President's rule then, okay? So the governor was there, they couldn't be bothered very much. So I invited these people, Dr. Subramania and Bodyguard. I said we went round looking at it since I was chairman of the council that we could go together and I said, look, extend it by another 2 kilometers along the palace, Bangalore Palace. They didn't. There was some problem. They said, now you spend 25-30 minutes just for that stretch of 1.5 kilometers. So this, there is nothing to do with engineering. It's just most objectionable, anti-social relationship between the contractor and the lower level engineers and the corporators and us, the MLAs. Make no mistake about it. How can you have huge potholes on a flyover? It's so dangerous. But you see photographs now in all the newspapers, Kannada and English. I've put them together, about 2,000 photographs now in the last 3 months to 4 months. Huge big craters. So somebody wrote that Suresh Menon of Hindu wrote that we should speak to the civil society, resident welfare associations, and with a lot of touching affection, each one of them would adopt a pothole and take care of the pothole. I mean, you know, and 6 months ago, 1 year ago, they said, send us a mail when you see a pothole. So I tried it. Some other identity, I sent about a dozen mails to the then commissioner in the corporation. There was no response. Then I spoke to the newspaper and they published it. I said, I had misunderstood the BBMP. What they meant was, send an email to the pothole. And there'll be a quick response to that. So I think people should speak up, fight. I mean, not violence, but...
Yeah, but seriously, flyovers are not a traffic solution. The city of Seoul, capital of South Korea, in a city they have demolished every single flyover. They said just shift the burden of traffic. Essence is good public transport. I think we've had a great session. It's been... You want to... Okay.
The country, every professors and every teachers who are teaching us, they are saying India is developing nation, and it kept remaining the same. Where do you see this interaction of crony capitalism? This is the government. Where do you see as evolution? I mean, give your more specific details on that. In India, we had a lot of stuff.
That will be a long answer. If you were in India in the 80s, till the 80s, if you wanted to buy a scooter, when you were born, your father would have to book a scooter. It's not a joke. You could not buy a watch, HMT watch. You had to go to the shop, give your name, your turn would come. So, much as I don't agree with the Congress party and the NAC, I think we cannot compare India of those days to India of now. To say India has not changed, I'm sorry, I will not buy that. And we could have gone much more, absolutely, absolutely. But to say India has not changed now, that's unfair, I think. Even to a politician. I love meeting politicians, but no, I think that's unfair.
Just as a data point, just as a data point, if you look at tele density, today out of the 1.25, 1.3 billion population that we have, we are close to we've just, I think, 2 months ago crossed 1 billion in terms of telephones connected to, people who have some mechanism as far as telephones is concerned. You go back to the 90s, that was 0.4 per thousand. And now it is running close to about 900 or 900 plus per thousand. So that's just one data point. And this has nothing to do with one government or two governments. It is consistently that it's been happening. It is nothing that somebody has done it, the other guy pulled back. It's not.
Rupesh?
Sir, if you see DRDO is a perfect example of public sector monopolistic thing. So if our country has opened the option of like foreign company investing and promoting a competitive environment,
Right.
why would you say that it is a bad thing?
No, I'm not sure I understood.
Rupesh did not. He said that we have allowed foreign companies but not Indian companies. If I trust Boeing and Grumman and Northrop, why can't I trust?
Why can't I trust a Larsen and
LNT and
Toubro and a
Tata?
Tatas and a Birlas?
Exactly.
Yeah, but then still, it is a perfect example of competitive
Yes.
environment.
He
And
wants
it is-
competition. To be fair, he wants
Absolutely.
competition.
I want competition. You look at ISRO. We were refused the cryogenic engine and we built our own. We were refused the supercomputer, we built our own.
Absolutely.
We built Param on our own.
We are Paramanaro. Absolutely.
So every time that we've been held back, we've gone and done something which has met our requirement. Why on defense? This is just by way of an example. Why on
Sir,
defense?
but then LCA does not give the same figures. Sir. The light combat aircraft actually it took quite some time, sir.
28 years.
I agree with you. And maybe it took time because of complacency. There wasn't competition.
You need the pressure of competition. There's a question there, right?
Yeah, I'm Royal, and my question is directed from the Myra College perspective and an entrepreneur's perspective towards Mr. Patnaik. Not just the bureaucrats, but also policymakers, corporates, academicians. So, where we are heading is the question. We are looking at the future and we're designing policies or taking actions looking at what is going to happen in the future. But we're still stuck in the past. We're still looking at what worked in the past, but we're not looking at what is happening right now, which can, help us take steps to make what is going to happen in the future faster. One example is technology and people are coming together. And this is accelerated by the use of mobile phones, that all of us have smartphones which are enabling applications, websites to be at our fingertips wherever we go. And this is actually connecting people in real time and helping people give services from one person to another. So this is where we are heading. We are heading towards an inflection point which you mentioned, accelerated by the use of mobile phones. And in real time, we are able to give services. I can give something that Mr. Shakti needs, or Mr. Shakti can answer a question that I have. We don't have to be in a conference anymore. We can use Twitter, we can use multiple applications to have real-time access. But technology is growing at the same time, which is enabling that kind of real-time interaction. So this is where we're heading. And my question to you guys is, how many of you are aware of what are the best technologies that are available in mobile phones, which you can use to empower yourself and then take decisions? But what we actually see is that, mobile phones are bad. They waste time. Technology has created laziness. No, it has not. It is making us more effective. In fact, there is innovation and innovation-driven enterprises, maybe entrepreneurs, maybe academicians, maybe researchers, policymakers. If they are pushing the boundary ahead, they are taking an innovative step towards a certain direction. They're all pushing the envelope towards that inflection point.
Let him answer it.
I think what you said is right. I don't think government is insensitive to the development of the mobile applications. In fact, very recently, we had an international workshop in Bangalore on cyber security, and we got the best brains from around the world to participate in it. See, use of application is in the private domain. If you want to network with someone to get some goods and services rendered through the new mobile applications, well, you are welcome. When in 90s, I remember Mr. T.N. Seshan was the election commissioner. He got a phone called car phone. So everyone was very saying, that guy is using something which none of us are using. You see, he's a privileged guy. A car phone then must have been only a mobile phone. And then the association of car phone or mobile phone was with the rich. And when mobile telephony penetrated the household of everyone, he may be a dhobi, he may be a priest doing service, everyone has got the benefit of it now. Now everyone is having it. It's not meant for the rich people. Not 2G, 3G, 4G technology is meant for the rich. It's another thing, the service provider may be rich. But the fact remains that it's used by everyone. So the government is fully aware of it. But associated with these new applications, there are many dangers. Is government prepared for it? I would say that is what is more important. Suppose a hacker takes sweeps it clean from your account. What does the police do? Does he go with a lathi? That's a question which we are now grappling with. Number two, the spread of extremism has been greatly accelerated by the use of internet. Now how does government view it? People sitting in some far remote place are able to influence the minds of young people and taking them to extremes. How is the government tackling this? These are challenges of the new age, and which we are very much concerned. We are trying to, in fact, even advanced countries are trying to beat it. And India is still in its rudiments, So we are definitely conscious of this fact. We are working towards it. But we would welcome anything that really aids and abets the very process of increasing our GDP in any manner. You see, in the coming week, Flipkart, Amazon, and all are competing with each other to sell their goodies. You imagine Dasara and Diwali. So, who is preventing them from doing so? Are we? We are not. I hope it answers
And
some of your
also, no, 1 minute. I'll tell you. The government is using it. Thank God, WikiLeaks. Why is India not there? All the documentation is manual. So they are not able to access it. We sometimes don't understand how much of a two-way process you have got, not only with your this, not only with your phones, even with your TV screens. Your TV screens can be used to monitor you unknown to you. So one has to be a little careful all the time when government using it. We do our intranet and internet on the same computer. I cannot think of anything more idiotic. So there are limits to it.
Can I add a point? Let me go back about 10, 12 years when the meltdown, when the Asian economies, the tiger economies were growing double figures. India was still at the proverbial Hindu rate of growth of 2, 3, 4%. A lot of central bank governors globally had criticized Reserve Bank of India at that point in time that India is backward, it's not forward looking, and so on and so forth. When the meltdown happened, India was more or less unaffected. The very same governors of those very same central banks, whether it was Federal Reserve or Bank of England, turned around and lauded the sagacity of the governor of the Reserve Bank of India not being risk prone and being very cautious in his...
And not being networked. Yeah, your question?
The government as well as the industry as well as trade unions have combined hands to take up an neutrality in the net usage. Then we consumers had to use internet as well as roads to protest regarding that. And also in the panel now, there is no one from the consumer point of view. There must be some from someone from the consumer forum to discuss when such a discussion is happening.
You're a consumer, I'm a consumer, I'm sure he's a consumer.
So what do you think about that? Why was there less transparency in the decision being taken that time?
Bring forth the concerns about the need of net neutrality, and also to get different viewpoints and opinions. It's been a debate. I think it continues to be a debate. I don't see any decision happening very soon. I guess we'll have to wait and see how it.
When you use the toll road, do we pay toll charges or not? We pay it, right? Then we don't ask for free. So I think there is more to the debate. It needs.
The question is about lack of transparency for taking data from the consumers. They have made it so difficult on the website to find that link and made a comment there. After that, TRAI has made a comment that there is need transparency to collect data from the consumers. And again, they have made it so tough that we have to go to a website, use a mobile number to get it registered, and then we have to make a comment.
I have no idea.
So my point is just about the lack of transparency there.
Maybe you're right. We need transparency.
And the point that you are raising is not about technical.
It's about transparency.
It is the data collection.
Okay.
That is privacy.
That's a privacy. That's a privacy. That's not good.
Flipkart puts through. No, I think the most valuable thing is all the data that they are holding. Eventually, it's a question of how smart you are in mining that data for business.
Which is why I refuse to do net banking even. I still sign checks.
The problem in this specific case is if Flipkart is collecting the information with your permission or without your permission.
Technically with your permission. Technically we all say yes without ever reading the 500 pages. The 500 pages are legally drafted pastry.
No, the question is, if they are doing it, there are organizations doing without your approval. That would always be considered illegal anyway.
That's it.
But what
In
is,
this case, it's not so.
yeah, but what is very, very frightening is a lot of us who are not net savvy, a lot of us who are app averse, a lot of us who don't have used the net to that extent. What is very frightening, if you get somebody who's very familiar with computers to check the net, the amount of personal data for an individual like that is available in the public domain is frightening. And those of us who are more net savvy, you can pretty much build the entire profile of that person. Most of us use personal passwords. When you use passwords, it's family, father, mother, date of birth, etc., some combination. It can be cracked in a matter of seconds. All that data is available public.
It is just not due to one organization.
Productive. And it's really added to the flavor. And I think those of you who've done this course last year, as you step out in the world in the next few months, I think this kind of thoughts will really help you fresh your mind. So, you have a formal vote of thanks, but I think as the moderator, I think I should give a great pleasure.
No, you should